Hey guys, tonight we step into a story that history has tried to avoid. Not because it was glorious, but because it was too dangerous to be told in its entirety. And every mystery in this tale revolves around two people. Henry VIII, a king driven by boundless ambition, and Eleanor Grey, the woman whose very presence could make an entire court fall silent. People once believed Eleanor was nothing more than a shadow drifting through scattered records, a meaningless name carried away by the wind of time. But the deeper historians dug, the more unsettling gaps they uncovered: erased diary pages, letters signed with unfamiliar initials, and empty spaces in the royal registers where her story should have been written. No one knows why Eleanor's traces vanished so quickly. What remains suggests only one truth. She was not a victim of love, but a woman who held secrets powerful enough to shake a throne. And tonight, we open that door, the one history has kept locked for centuries. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Before we begin, leave a comment below. Where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are right now? It's fascinating how one story can connect people awake together in so many corners of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. A wife whom even Henry VIII feared. Eleanor Grey, a brilliant, sharp-minded, mysterious queen. She did not disappear like an ordinary shadow. She was erased deliberately. No grave to mourn, no portrait to recognize, and her name was pulled out of the records with unsettling precision. All that remains are a few letters discovered recently, delicate as the last breath of a fading life, revealing a dark truth. Her love for the king had turned into obsession, and the secrets she carried were powerful enough to shake the Tudor throne. Her story does not begin when she lived, but after she died, as if her spirit never left the cold walls of Whitehall, still wandering quietly, watching, whispering things no chronicler dared record. Eleanor was born into a modest branch of the noble Grey family. Her father, Thomas Grey, came from a lesser northern line, granted a small title but never true wealth. Her mother, Millicent Harrow, was a quiet, thoughtful woman, known for her sharp memory and the uncanny ability to read people within seconds. Eleanor had two older brothers, Arthur and James, and a younger sister, Beatrice. The family was not rich, but their tradition was firm. The children had to learn reading, writing, and etiquette before they even learned to ride a horse. She grew up among dusty libraries and wooden corridors smelling of rain. From childhood she learned to see the world not with innocence, but with a delicate, cautious intelligence. Her fateful encounter with Henry VIII happened in the winter of that year, when her father was summoned to court to present a petition about northern lands. Eleanor accompanied her mother to the celebratory feast. In the great hall, between the flickering golden candles, Henry noticed her first, a young woman with ash-brown hair and eyes that seemed to know more than she spoke. He asked her name. She bowed and answered, and that single moment rippled through the court. Henry had known many women, yet none had held her silence with such deliberate control. From that moment, her destiny shifted. The palace she entered was not a place of welcome. It rose before her like a sprawling labyrinth of gold and shadow, the stone walls leaning inward as though listening to every footstep. The hallways were lined with portraits of queens, long-forgotten faces, serene, eyes dulled by centuries of candle smoke. Even in daylight, darkness clung to the vaulted ceilings like webs spun from old secrets. This was a place where truth was bought with smiles, and honesty was buried beneath layers of silence. The winter wind whistled through stained-glass windows, and the River Thames below had frozen into wide slabs of ice. From her carriage, Eleanor watched London's torches flicker through the fog, like stars struggling not to die. The crowd shouted her name, not because they knew her, but because they had watched too many brides pass through this gate to believe any would endure for long. When Eleanor stepped into the great hall, the scent of honeyed candles mingled with the stale rot of old secrets. Courtiers bowed low, but their eyes were sharp, measuring her worth, calculating how long she might survive the dangerous game they all played. On the throne, Henry wore crimson silk, his gaze lighting up the instant he saw her. It was a gaze both hungry and calculating. He had known affection, rage, grief, and loss. But in Eleanor he saw something else, his own power reflected back through her poise and quiet intelligence. To him, it felt like love. To everyone else, it was a sentence wrapped in velvet. When Eleanor curtsied, the whisper of silk against stone sounded like an ancient sigh. Music rose, and the court exhaled in relief. Yet beneath the polished laughter, danger pooled like ink spreading on parchment. That night, in her new chambers, Eleanor watched snow fall thickly across the courtyard. The city slept under a winter hush, unaware that the real storm had just been sealed behind palace walls. Before her name was wiped away, she had belonged to another world entirely. A quiet countryside where the grass smelled of dawn, moisture and lilies, where mornings arrived slowly and the mist lingered, as though reluctant to leave. Her childhood home stood at the blurred boundary, where meadow faded into forest, a place where silence was not emptiness but breath. Her father, a minor noble with ambition larger than his estate, smiled at opportunity but never at his children. Her mother, pale and cautious, taught her the art of silence, the kind that opened doors more swiftly than any polished speech. She grew up listening to the whispers of visitors from London, men who spoke in low voices about the king who changed wives as easily as garments. Other girls practiced embroidery, stitching flowers onto fabric, while she practiced observation, reading a smile tilted by half a fraction, hearing the altered breath of a lie, sensing the shift in a gaze when the word power entered the room. Her beauty was both pure and sharp, like a blade polished to gleam in sunlight, hair the colour of burnished chestnut catching red glints, eyes soft, yet always calculating. Painters tried to capture her, but each portrait lacked the same thing, the quiet alertness beneath the innocence. When the envoys of Henry VIII arrived, her household reacted as though heaven itself had stepped onto their threshold. Servants rushed through corridors, scrubbing floors, polishing silver that had forgotten its shine for many years. Trunks were opened, linens aired, candles lit even in daylight. But Eleanor stood still, watching the frenzy with the detached calm of someone who already knew the ending of the play being rehearsed. She understood what such a summons meant. She also understood that once she left, she would never return unchanged. Her first meeting with Henry was nothing like the poets later imagined. There were no gasping courtiers, no stunned silence, no celestial omen, only two people who recognized in each other the same hunger, the hunger to be remembered by history. She was not enchanted, nor was she afraid. And it was precisely that serene composure that startled Henry. Rumours spread in the way. Rumours always do swiftly and without restraint. Some whispered that she had bewitched the king with a single glance. Others claimed she resembled a woman he had once loved. But to Eleanor, none of it mattered. Love was a luxury she could not afford. Survival was the only currency. At night, when the scent of roses drifted through the window and the torches along the road flickered like distant fireflies, she sometimes allowed herself to dream not of jewels, nor of crowns, but of something far simpler. Safety. A place where she would not need to weigh every word, where no one's favour could determine her fate. But the wind outside carried only the chill of the city, restless and sharp. And she understood then the first thing the palace would take from her was peace. Days passed in a quiet waiting, as though time itself was holding its breath. Her father walked taller, her mother prayed more, her brothers polished their boots and practiced bows, and her little sister traced Eleanor's face with curious fingers, as though memorizing it before it changed forever. In those final nights before departure, Eleanor walked the edges of the estate, listening to owls and watching frost form on the grass. She felt something closing behind her, even before it happened. When the carriage finally came, lacquered and bearing the royal crest, she did not tremble. She stepped inside as though stepping across an invisible threshold between life and legend. The wheels rolled over frozen earth, and the countryside faded behind her like a dream dissolving at dawn. London rose before her like a beast of stone and smoke. The air tasted of coal and cold iron. Bells tolled, torches flared. People gathered not because they knew her, but because they recognized a pattern, another bride entering the lion's mouth. Eleanor watched them through the window, her expression calm, her heartbeat steady. And in that moment she knew. The palace would not break her quickly. It would erode her gently, the way water hollows stone. But she also knew something else. Something the historians would one day fear to write. She would not go quietly. Their wedding unfolded like a stained glass painting, glimmering, delicate, and destined to fracture. The church bells tolled without pause, ringing so fiercely that even the air seemed to tremble beneath the sound. The streets were crowded, every inch filled with bodies pressed together, faces lifted toward the rare winter sunlight that glimmered like a fragile blessing. They cheered as though this were a union of love, though everyone knew the truth. Power, not affection, was the true master of the ceremony. She stepped into the sanctuary veiled in white as thin as mist. Each step she took echoed like the heartbeat of an empty room, a soft thud swallowed by stone walls that had witnessed too many vows, too many endings. Frankincense blended with the metallic smell of candle smoke, and the thick air made her chest tighten. When Henry VIII placed his hand upon hers, she felt no warmth, only the weight of a fate descending like a crown made of iron. To the crowd, she appeared a radiant queen beside a redeemed king. But among the sea of faces were eyes that refused to meet hers, lips pressed into tight lines, expressions that looked less like celebration and more like resignation. It was as though they were watching a curse repeat itself. The spirits of the former queens seemed to linger unnamed, unsummoned, but unmistakably present, their invisible shadows clinging to the hems of gowns and the hush of breath drawn too slowly. The wedding night was a ritual gilded with gold rather than tenderness. Her chamber was draped in red velvet, roses scattered across the floor, perfume curling through the air with a sweetness that bordered on suffocating. But when the final attendant slipped away and the last door closed, the room fell into a silence, so heavy it felt like a physical weight. Music from the banquet drifted faintly through the walls, dim as a dying star. She removed the crown from her head, and felt the deep indentation it left upon her skin, a reminder that power always bruised before it adorned. She looked into the mirror. The reflection was not that of a joyful bride, but of a stranger, eyes calm to the point of eeriness, mouth composed, face pale with a serenity that felt more like surrender than bliss. Outside, snow spiraled through the wind, like 1,000 restless spirits searching for a crack to slip through. She raised her hand and touched the glass, her breath fogging the surface, and whispered, "The performance begins." From that moment forward, she was no longer the girl of the countryside. Whatever softness she once carried belonged to a life that had already vanished behind her. Now she was a queen, but she was also a prisoner of the throne, bound by silks that felt like chains and surrounded by luxury that tasted like confinement. The echoes of the ceremony lingered in her ears long after the candles dimmed. The bells from earlier in the day still seemed to vibrate through her bones, as though the sound had imprinted itself upon her. She sat upon the edge of her bed, the velvet comforter heavy beneath her, and listened to the distant roar of celebration that she knew would soon be followed by whispers. Whispers about her expression, her composure, her silence, her every breath. Outside her window, the courtyard was blanketed in white. Guards marched in slow, deliberate patterns, their armor glinting in the moonlight like small, cold stars. She watched them move, and realized that from this night onward, her life would be observed the same way, measured, documented, judged. The crown had not just been placed upon her head, it had been fastened around her existence. She lay down, but rest did not come. The air in the chamber felt too still, as though the room itself were holding its breath. She knew then that there was no going back. The countryside, the soft mornings, the laughter of her sister, the quiet, moss-covered stones behind her childhood home, all of it had dissolved like snow, melting on warm skin. She closed her eyes, and in the darkness behind her eyelids, she saw the stained glass colours shatter, scattering into shards. She did not flinch. She only breathed and waited. From that day onward, strange signs began to appear, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. A letter that should have been delivered to her simply vanished, leaving no trace, not a torn seal, not a misplaced ribbon, only an absence that felt intentional. A door she approached, eased shut just before she reached it, the soft click echoing down the corridor like a whispered warning. Music drifted through the halls at night, a lone instrument playing in a chamber where she had not been invited, each note stretched thin as though plucked by an unseen hand. Then came the rose wilted, darkening at the edges, laid upon her pillow. Its stem was soaked, as though it had been freshly cut beneath moonlight. She held it in silence, felt the weight of what it implied, and before dawn arrived she burned it in the hearth. The petals curled in on themselves, turning to ash, rising like smoke that resembled a bad omen too bold to ignore. The smiles at the banquet table began to lose their warmth. What once resembled merriment now felt like a performance rehearsed too many times. The laughter no longer rang like bells, but like hollow echoes bouncing against stone. Each time Henry took her hand, she felt none of the tenderness the crowd imagined, only a faint chill, lingering like a warning pressed against her skin. The palace, once a marvel of gold and light, was shifting. It was becoming a mask, a glittering facade hiding something far darker beneath its polished surface. Nights grew longer. The candles in her chambers dimmed faster than they should have, their flames bending sideways as though disturbed by a breath that did not belong to her. The shadows stretched strangely, pooling in corners, untouched by moonlight. Servants avoided meeting her eyes, stepping softly, bowing too quickly, as though afraid that proximity alone might draw them into whatever unseen current surrounded her. She began closing the curtains before sleeping, yet even thick velvet could not keep out the sensation of being watched. She woke one morning to find the mirror slightly shifted, angled just enough to reflect her bed rather than the window. No one admitted to moving it. Another night, the candles by her bedside flared high without wind, then extinguished themselves, leaving her in a silence so deep she could hear her own heartbeat. The corridors outside her chambers carried whispers, not words, just the shape of voices, like thoughts half-formed. She told no one. The danger of speaking was greater than the danger of knowing. By the end of that week, the atmosphere within the palace had changed. The air itself felt tense, as though every breath carried a secret not meant to be heard. The servants walked quickly, their footsteps careful, their gazes lowered. The courtiers spoke softly, measuring their phrases, tasting each syllable before releasing it. And the laughter at supper sounded different, not like joy, not even like mockery, but like something imitating life. A brittle sound, stretched thin, ready to snap. Henry's touch became rarer, and when it came, it was colder. His eyes wandered, not away from her, but around her, as though searching for something that was not present. His voice, once booming and confident, carried a strange tension, like a man unsure whether he was being observed. She sensed it then, not fear, but awareness. The king, Lord of England, master of crowns and cannons, felt watched in his own palace, and she understood something crucial. Whatever was happening was not directed only at her. It was around them both. The palace itself seemed to breathe differently, its walls holding memories like lungs filled with old air. It was no longer merely a residence or a throne-roomed fortress. It was a creature silent, watchful, patient. A creature that had seen too many brides, too many oaths, too many endings. A creature that remembered what humans tried to forget. The corridors grew colder as she walked them. The tapestries stirred though there was no draught. The guards shifted uneasily, hands tightening on spears, though no threat was visible. Even the snow outside seemed to fall more quietly, as though listening. She began to sense that something unseen was circling her, testing, waiting, learning the rhythm of her breath. And though she stood tall, though her steps remained steady, she felt the truth settle upon her like frost. The palace was no longer merely watching her. It was choosing what to do with her. And in the stillness of that realization, she understood the most unsettling thing of all. She was no longer afraid. Morning began to arrive more slowly, as though the sun itself hesitated to touch the palace. Light slipped through the windows in thin, blade-like slivers, no longer warm, no longer gentle. The servants in her chambers walked with softer footsteps, careful not to let their shoes whisper against the floor. They avoided her gaze, bowing quickly, vanishing like smoke. She spoke less with each passing day, knowing that every word would be weighed, interpreted, and repeated in rooms she would never enter. Even her own reflection in the mirror became unfamiliar. An immaculate queen, flawless, polished, and utterly devoid of warmth. It was a face the world admired, but not a face that belonged to her. The crown no longer rested upon her head. It pressed inward, heavy and unyielding, as though it were shaping her soul to fit its cold frame. Every gesture carried a cost. Every silence carried suspicion. Henry became distant, his visits growing fewer, separated by stretches of nights that felt endless. When he did appear, he left behind hollow compliments, words that evaporated before reaching her heart. and a chill in the air that lingered long after he was gone. In the space he abandoned, her thoughts twisted inward, turning against themselves like vines searching for something to cling to. She wandered the corridors lined with portraits of queens who came before her. Their painted eyes, blurred by candle soot and time, stared downward with an expression that now felt unmistakable. They were beautiful, perfectly composed, but the stiffness in their smiles and the stillness in their gaze revealed the truth. They had been afraid, and that fear had been sealed beneath layers of oil and varnish. In their silence, she saw the warning they had never been allowed to speak. She realized then what devotion could not accomplish, and what love could never protect. No one had ever been saved by loyalty. She began choosing carefully who was allowed near her. Her smiles became fewer, delivered only when necessary. Kindness transformed into strategy, used sparingly like a precious resource. People mistook her composure for serenity, not knowing it was armor. Slowly, isolation reshaped her thoughts. Laughter echoing down the hall sounded rehearsed. Words of concern rang hollow, like scripted lines spoken by unwilling actors. Even the tapestries seemed alive, their woven figures watching her with stitched eyes that never blinked. Then the letters arrived unsigned, unsealed, unmistakably deliberate. They envy you. They wait for your fall. She burned every one of them, but the ashes clung to her fingertips like soot that would not wash away. In the mirror, she saw a different woman, staring back, lips pressed tightly, gaze sharpened, a quiet vigilance replacing softness. She understood that survival required more than grace. It demanded a coldness stronger than fear, a mind sharper than intrigue. One night, watching the snow drift past the window in a slow, spiraling descent, she whispered, "Let them watch." In that moment, she no longer felt small. The walls that once loomed over her now felt level with her gaze. The gaze of the portraits no longer pierced her. It bowed. The silence of the corridors no longer smothered her. It listened. She had crossed an invisible threshold, not into cruelty, but into clarity. She would not shrink. She would not plead. She would not break. She began to understand the unspoken law of the palace. To survive, one could not merely be queen. One had to become something rarer, something more dangerous, something the court feared to lose and feared to confront. Power did not belong to the loud, nor to the beloved. Power belonged to the one who could endure without crumbling, the one who learned to turn dread into authority, the one who could stand alone and remain unshaken. Snow continued falling outside, each flake disappearing into the darkness below. But inside the chamber she felt something settle within her. Not peace, not triumph, but a stillness that felt like awakening. She was no longer merely enduring the palace. She was beginning to possess it. From the moment she whispered, "Let them watch," she crossed an invisible boundary. The palace was no longer merely a prison, but a stage, and she decided she would be the one to write the script rather than perform in someone else's play. The softness within her did not disappear all at once. It slowly folded inward, retreating like a tide, leaving behind something else in its place: control. She realized that power did not come from the throne, nor from titles or jewels, but from what people feared losing. At first, the change was subtle, almost imperceptible. A suggestion spoken a fraction slower, a glance held a heartbeat longer, a servant reassigned for speaking a little too freely. The favors she once granted out of kindness became moves placed deliberately, like pieces on a quiet chessboard. Punishment, whether gentle or severe, carried messages sharper than blades. Those who once believed themselves unnoticed began to understand. The queen was watching them more closely than the king. In the mornings, as attendants dressed her, she sat motionless, still as carved stone. The servants felt unease ripple beneath their skin, as though they were fastening gowns onto a statue that might awaken. When she entered a room, conversations faltered, thinning into silence. That silence no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like command. Henry began to grow unsettled by the calm she carried. He was accustomed to tears, to anger, to pleading, but she stood before him like a mirror that reflected not emotion, but consequence. When he spoke of loyalty, she answered with the word legacy. When he demanded love, she returned devotion measured in outcomes and advantage. Though he never said it aloud, he recognized the shift. She was no longer someone he could shape. She was someone who could fracture the illusion he had built around himself. His voice wavered more often. His gaze lingered too long. Something in him, a king who feared nothing, began to fear her. It did not take much. One trivial insult uttered by a noblewoman was enough for the queen to act. Privileges vanished. Petitions for the woman's family were denied. Her name vanished from the guest list for the next feast. The message spread like wind through winter branches, not the king, but the queen was the one they dared not offend. She did not shout. She did not threaten. Her silence did the work. The atmosphere of the court shifted. Bows dipped lower. Voices softened. Eyes avoided lingering on her face too long, afraid that attention itself might be misinterpreted. She moved through the palace with a quiet that felt like authority, and people sensed it even before they understood it. A ripple became a current, and a current became a tide. Yet in the coldest nights, when the fires burned low and even the guards' footsteps faded into distance, a small part of her heart still remembered the girl from the countryside, the one who dreamed not of power, but of peace. She remembered dew on grass, the scent of lilies, her sister's laughter. Those memories did not warm her. They ached, and it was the space between what she once desired and what she now required to survive that bent the shape of her soul. She would stand by the window, gazing at the snow falling in slow spirals, and feel a hollow place inside something neither power nor control could fill. The crown weighed more heavily on nights like that, pressing into her thoughts. She wondered if any queen had ever survived without becoming something harder than her own heart. But dawn always arrived, pale and indifferent, and with it came another day where she could not afford softness. The court watched her too closely. The king relied on her steadiness too silently. The palace itself seemed to breathe around her, waiting to see what she would become. And she understood this truth. To endure in the palace, she could not merely remain queen. She had to become the thing they feared losing, and the thing they feared facing, a presence that could not be ignored, a force that could not be diminished, a woman shaped not by love, nor by devotion, but by survival sharpened into elegance. And as the snow continued to fall like ash outside her window, she felt the final thread of her former self loosen. She did not grieve it. She only breathed and continued. As her power rippled outward like invisible waves, her enemies multiplied in silence. Men who once regarded her as nothing more than an ornament now measured each word before speaking in her presence. They could not understand how letters written in her hand could redirect decisions across the kingdom, influence alliances, or stall decrees. They only knew that once their names appeared on her lists, those discreet records she never displayed their futures could change color overnight. She used her smile to conceal the web of information she wove. Every nod became a promise wrapped in silk. Every brief conversation, seemingly harmless, became a fragment added to the portrait she was constructing. By the time anyone realized the extent of her influence, it was already too late. She had rooted herself into signatures, proclamations, and the soft debts of favors owed. Power had begun to flow toward her, not through force, but through inevitability. In the candlelight, she sometimes caught her reflection in the glass, something not entirely human, yet something not monstrous either. A being carved by survival, sharpened by necessity. Her heart still beat, but no longer to the rhythm of hope. It pulsed instead to the rhythm of calculation, timing, and consequence. She whispered to the silence, "They have made me into what they fear." And in those words lived two truths: pride, and a sorrow too deep to carry a name. Then one morning, everything ended, not with swords, not with spectacle, not with the roaring judgment of a public execution. The order arrived quietly, like frost settling over a field. Before the sun had fully risen, servants received commands to burn her gowns, to strip her emblems from the walls, to melt the ring she had once touched. Portraits were taken down, their painted eyes covered first, as though even art might accuse those who removed it. Within a handful of hours, the woman who had once sat beside the king vanished from every traceable surface. Her name was no longer spoken in the ceremonial hall. Songs once played in her honor were removed from the repertoire. Even the hunting hounds she had fed with her own hands were led away, their collars buried deep in garden soil. For those who dared to inquire, the answers came wrapped in silk. She has departed. She is unwell. She requires rest. But the disappearance carried no sound, no announcement, no closure. And it was the silence that frightened most of all. The courtiers smiled more broadly than before, relieved yet uneasy, like actors performing without knowing whether the audience still watched. The palace adjusted quickly on the surface, but something in the air shifted an unease that settled into the stone itself. The corridors she once walked seemed to hold their breath. The servants avoided certain rooms at dusk. The musicians hesitated before playing melodies she once preferred, as though the notes themselves might summon her memory. Records were altered. Clerks crossed out entries, scraped ink from ledgers, rewrote dates so that her presence dissolved between one winter and the next. Documents she had signed were recopied without her hand. When the royal chronicler refused to alter his pages, he was sent north, his manuscript confiscated. The next edition contained no hint that she had ever lived. For the court, erasure became a relief. Fear functioned best when there was no proof. But the walls of the palace, the ancient stones that had witnessed too many secrets, refused to forget. In the long gallery where her footsteps once echoed softly, faint scratches remained on the plaster where her jewels brushed. A faint stain on the floor marked where a goblet had fallen during a night no one now acknowledged. These remnants meant nothing to most who passed through. Yet the youngest maids avoided those spaces after dark. One evening, a maid carrying candles swore she heard humming in the empty room an old melody that had once played during a winter banquet. She dropped the tray, and wax splattered across the floor like spilled starlight. Rumour curled through the palace like smoke from an unseen flame. The silence surrounding the Queen's disappearance did not settle. It deepened. Those who remembered her did not speak. Those who tried to forget found their dreams filled with fragments white veils, falling snow, the soft scrape of silk across stone. And though her body was gone, and her name erased, something remained, something watching, something listening, something unfinished. The fear was no longer about where she went. It was about whether she had truly gone at all. After the image was removed from the wall, the pages followed. The scribes bent over their desks, scraping her name from the registers, erasing her signature from official documents. Dates were adjusted, rewritten, shifted to conceal the gaps she had once filled. Every trace of her handwriting was treated like contamination. One royal historian refused to alter his chronicle, and he was sent away to a distant posting, his manuscript seized. In the next edition, she had never existed at all. The court exhaled with relief. Fear became easier to bear when no evidence remained. If there was no name, no portrait, no grave, then no guilt could cling to them. They drank wine, laughed more loudly than before, bowed more deeply to the king, as though to prove that their memories were spotless and compliant. They congratulated themselves for their loyalty, for their silence, for their ability to forget on command. But the walls remained honest. In the long corridor where her laughter had once drifted like light, faint scratches were still visible where her jewels had brushed the plaster. Near the window, a pale stain marked the place where a goblet had shattered during an evening no one now acknowledged. These remnants were trivial to the nobles, but to the maids they were enough to inspire dread. None dared pass that hallway after sunset. They whispered of draughts that smelled faintly of rosewater, of shadows that lingered too long. One night, a young maid carrying candles approached the place where her portrait had once hung. The corridor was dark, silent, empty. Then she heard it, a soft humming from the shadows, a tune from a banquet no one else recalled. Her hands shook. She dropped the tray. Candles toppled, and wax spilled across the floor in bright droplets, glowing like tiny fallen stars. She fled without looking back. The next morning, the king himself walked alone through that corridor. His steps were heavy, echoing against the stone. He stopped before the blank space on the wall where her face had once watched over the hall. His hand rose slowly and brushed the edge of the faded outline where the frame had been. No one could say what passed through his mind in that moment. His expression revealed nothing. He turned away and ordered the entire hallway sealed. No passage, no access, no explanation. And so she disappeared, not through fire, not through execution, not through burial. She vanished through revision, through omission, through the reshaping of memory into something more comfortable. Her name slipped from every transcript, from every whispered prayer, from every story told beside evening hearths. But memory did not obey commands like soldiers. It continued to seep through the cracks into kitchens, into the servants' quarters, into the dreams of those who had seen her even once. The absence of her became a shadow, draped over everything they tried to forget. In the laundry rooms, women repeated fragments, how her eyes used to follow a conversation, even when she did not speak. In the stables, grooms swore the hunting hounds paced at night, searching for someone who no longer called them by name. In the chapel, a priest claimed the candles burned lower on the side where she once knelt. None of them spoke loudly. None of them admitted belief. But silence could not drown the feeling that something had been removed, wrongly, unnaturally. Nobles began dreaming of her standing at the edge of their vision, veiled in white, neither accusing nor forgiving. Musicians woke with melodies they could not remember learning. A seamstress found herself stitching a hem she recognized but could not place. A page boy swore he saw a figure pass through a locked door without sound. No one spoke of it openly, but everyone felt it. Her erasure did not erase her. It amplified her. The palace grew quieter, as though listening for footsteps that never came. Conversations faltered when snow fell against the windows. Servants crossed themselves before opening wardrobes. The king stopped sleeping through the night, rising to pace halls that no longer existed on official maps. The absence became presence. The silence became voice. And the memory they tried to bury deepened instead, spreading like ink through parchment. Not a haunting, not a ghost, just the lingering truth of someone the world had not been allowed to remember, and the fear that if her name could be erased, so could theirs. Years passed, and no one dared to speak her name aloud. Yet her story drifted through dim places, kitchens, monasteries, roadside inns. People did not recount it with certainty, but with phrases that always began the same way. It is said that each teller added a little, removed a little, reshaped the tale like softened wax. Still, a few details repeated with uncanny persistence, like a melody that refuses to fade. A silver box, a necklace shaped like a rose with thorns, letters hidden beneath the stones of a chapel floor. A former lady-in-waiting, dismissed from court, claimed she had once seen the Queen writing after midnight not letters for the king, but for someone unseen. The ink, she said, smelled faintly of metal, and the words spoke of betrayal and of secrets buried behind the chapel doors. A guard swore that on the final night before the Queen vanished, a cloaked visitor entered her chambers, unannounced, unrecorded, unnamed. The figure stayed less than an hour, leaving during a storm, while the candle in her room still burned and the window stood open to the wind. In a distant village, old women whispered tales far stranger. They said her heart was buried separately, sealed inside a silver box engraved with thorns. They said her spirit followed the man who betrayed her, whispering into his ear until his hair turned white with fear. No one had proof. No one needed proof. Fear was always complete without reason. A record in Canterbury spoke of a confession given by a dying maid. She described a hidden chest beneath the chapel floor, filled with the Queen's letters, each sealed with red wax. The monastery sent word to the crown, but the message was intercepted. The monk who wrote it disappeared before the month ended. Scholars centuries later dismissed these accounts as folklore, yet when they pieced the fragments together, a pattern emerged. Gaps in records, names crossed out, ellipses in official histories, all of it circling a single woman who had not been permitted to exist. It conjured a chilling possibility. Perhaps she knew she would be erased, and she left messages behind for the one man she loved, but that man never received them. The rumors did not stop there. They deepened, like footsteps descending into darker rooms. Travelers spoke of a song heard only during winter storms, a tune that matched no hymn, but felt familiar to those who once served the crown. A baker claimed that when she kneaded dough on certain nights, flour arranged itself into the shape of a rose. A child insisted she saw a woman in white standing by the old abbey gate, though the abbey had been abandoned for years. No one acknowledged these stories in daylight, but at night they spread. The silence of her absence became heavier than any spoken memory. Even those who never saw her began to dream of her standing at the edge of their vision, veiled, calm, watching. She did not threaten. She did not mourn. She simply waited, as though time itself belonged to her. In taverns, men lowered their voices when her tale arose. In cloisters, monks crossed themselves when the wind rattled the shutters. In manor houses, noble families avoided certain rooms on winter evenings. Her story had become something more than history, something more persistent than fact. It had become inevitability. Some whispered that the king never fully recovered from the silence surrounding her disappearance, that he woke in the night and called out to someone no one else could see. Others claimed that when he prayed, he left one space unspoken, as though saving it for a name he could not utter. The chronicles did not record these things, but memory did. And then came the most unsettling detail of all, repeated in different regions, separated by long distances and many years. A single note found in a forgotten ledger, written in a woman's hand. The ink faded but legible. The rose is cut, but the root endures. Who wrote it? No one could prove. But every handwriting scholar who examined it agreed it matched the queen whose name had been erased. And with that small sentence, doubt began to breathe again. Time continued to move forward. Dynasties changed. Palaces crumbled. Yet the fragments of her story did not disappear. They sank like stones beneath water, waiting for a hand bold enough to overturn them. Many centuries later, a strange note was discovered in old financial ledgers, tucked between dry tax entries. It read, "The rose has been cut, but the root still lives." The handwriting was hers, recognizable, elegant, unmistakable. By the 19th century, when restoration began on the remnants of Tudor palaces, the fragments began to surface with more persistence. At Hampton Court, workers uncovered a sealed passageway, hidden behind warped wooden panels. Beyond it lay a room no larger than a cell, suffocating in its stillness, containing only a single chair turned to face the wall. Everything else was bare except for a scrap of painted canvas wedged behind a beam. When unrolled, it revealed part of a woman's face. A pale cheek, a lace collar, a faint, enigmatic smile. There was no name, no inscription, no heraldry. But pigment analysis traced it precisely to the years when her name had been wiped from the royal chronicle. And one detail chilled those who studied it. The necklace in the painting was a silver rose with thorns. Soon after, an archivist sorting misfiled documents found an envelope tucked into paperwork associated with Edward VI. Inside was a torn page bearing handwriting unmistakably feminine. The ink had faded, but the sentence could still be read. "If truth wishes to survive, it must hide among lies." The script matched the few surviving samples attributed to her. Curiosity shifted into obsession. Historians, researchers, and amateur enthusiasts turned their attention toward monasteries, libraries, and decaying estates, hunting for traces. They did not find a complete story. Instead, they discovered suspicious absences, places where the term queen appeared with no name following, places where initials had been scraped away, passages interrupted mid-sentence. In a museum in York, a curator restoring an antique locket uncovered a strand of brown hair sealed behind glass. The inner casing bore a single engraved word, "Remember." Scientific testing proved inconclusive, but it did not matter. Her words had gained life again, not within the court that erased her, but in the minds of those who refused to look away. With every discovery, her outline sharpened, not as a ghost, but as a question. Who decides who is remembered and who must be forgotten? The more scholars searched, the more contradictions they found. A ledger from a manor house mentioned a winter banquet where a queen in silver had presided, yet no official record marked a queen at the royal court that year. A monastery inventory listed a donation of clothing fit for a crowned lady, though the reigning monarch at the time was unmarried. A sailor's journal referenced a rumour that the king once forbade musicians from playing a certain melody, though the journal never stated why. Each fragment alone was nothing. Together, they formed a shadow. The Victorian newspapers published speculative columns. Some dismissed her as myth. Some argued she was a forgotten betrothed, a foreign bride whose marriage had been annulled. But others whispered a darker thought that she had indeed been queen, and that history had been deliberately rewritten. Private collectors began trading items rumoured to be connected to her rings, scraps of fabric, prayer books with marginalia. The church denied every story. The aristocracy laughed. The monarchy remained silent. But silence only fed the intrigue. In university halls, lecturers spoke cautiously about the erased consort. In private salons, women spoke her name with quiet admiration. In dim study rooms, scholars compared ink strokes and parchment fibres, tracing patterns no one had been meant to follow. And through all of this, the same question lingered. If she was never meant to be remembered, Why did her story keep resurfacing? It was as if history itself resisted the command to forget, as if truth, once buried, had begun to push upward like roots beneath stone, as if the woman they tried to erase had found a way to exist where no monarch, no council, no chronicler could reach in doubt, in wonder, in the collective imagination of those who sensed there was something missing from the official tale. With each new hint, she stepped closer to the world again, not as a spectre haunting castles, but as a silence that refused to stay silent. And the people who encountered these traces felt the same unsettling certainty. Some stories do not die because they are forgotten. They die only when no one goes looking. And someone, somewhere, was still looking for her. From those scattered papers, those torn fragments of canvas, her figure began to return not as a ghost, but as a truth demanding the right to exist. The 19th century slipped quietly into the 20th, and scholars grew bolder, digging deeper, questioning what earlier historians had avoided. They began to probe the empty spaces left in Tudor records, asking questions no one in that age had been permitted to ask. Who was she before she was made a queen? What did she say before she was silenced? What had she known that others feared? The answers did not emerge from official chronicles, but from what researchers began calling the fallen pieces. Small artifacts that had survived because no one realized they mattered. In a small museum in Kent, a half-burned candle was discovered, and beneath its metal base were two letters engraved over one another, forming a symbol scholars could not decode. In a northern library, a single page from an ancient prayer book contained a handwritten plea in Latin, delicate, trembling, unmistakably similar to the script on the torn letter found years earlier. Then came the portrait. A gallery curator, restoring a religious painting, removed the inner wooden support and found another canvas hidden underneath. When the surface was cleaned, the face of a woman emerged proud, sorrowful, alive, as though caught between breath and memory. Her eyes held a depth that felt unnervingly modern, as though she saw through time itself. The expression suggested knowledge of secrets, of betrayals, of a king who once feared her. Experts argued for months. Some insisted it was coincidence. Others proposed it was an unfinished study. But the more the academic world dismissed it, the more the public became enthralled. People did not need a name to understand that she mattered. The questions grew louder, heavier, more insistent. A queen erased from the royal timeline, such a thing could only happen if her existence had been more dangerous than her death. And so her memory began to acquire a new life. She appeared in late-night exhibitions, in whispered lectures, in documentaries recorded in dim halls. Historians debated her identity. Podcasters recounted the rumors. Students wrote papers arguing that the erasure was deliberate. Her story was no longer a void, it had become an echo, distorted but undeniable. What unsettled people most was not her beauty, nor her tragedy, nor even her disappearance. It was the creeping sense that she had never truly left. For between the rewritten lines of history, something seemed to resist, fading like a hand resting lightly against the edge of a door, waiting for the moment when time would fracture just enough to let her through again. Researchers complained of strange coincidences. Pages fell open to the same passages. Archival boxes mislabeled for centuries contained documents relevant to her. A curator in London swore that each time she tried to store the silver rose necklace replica, it slid back into sight. A graduate student researching another queen entirely found her name scratched faintly into the margin of a map, faint but present. The more they looked, the more she appeared. Not fully, not clearly, but continually, as though memory itself were conspiring. In Oxford, a lecturer claimed that during a winter storm, the lights in his study flickered, and the portrait reproduction seemed to warm with colour. In Edinburgh, a historian awoke from a dream with a sentence in her mind later discovered to match a phrase found in a confiscated Tudor draft. In York, a museum guard refused to patrol a particular corridor, insisting he heard silk brushing stone though no one walked there. None of this could be cited in academic journals, but all of it was whispered. And something extraordinary began to happen. People started asking not whether she had existed, but why someone had tried so hard to erase her. Why a king would order silence instead of execution. Why a queen would disappear without a trace, yet leave behind roots that refused to die. She became not merely a historical puzzle, but a mirror reflecting a deeper truth that history is not a record of what happened, but of what survived the scissors. And she had survived. Not in documents, not in monuments, but in the persistent unease that accompanies a truth buried incorrectly. Her story was no longer about the past. It had become about the fracture between memory and power, and those who studied her began to understand something both thrilling and terrifying. Some lives are too dangerous to remember, and too powerful to forget. By the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, interest in her surged with sudden force, as though something beneath the surface had begun pushing upward. Libraries reported strange duplications, copies of records from different regions, showing the same signature crossed out in the same place, as if erased by the same invisible hand. Monasteries discovered that several diary pages had been cut away, always from the exact same passage. These irregularities did not weaken the story. They sharpened it, like a blade honed by repetition. An archivist claimed that, when he touched a page believed to have been written by her, the ink felt damp, as though someone had written it the day before, not centuries earlier. Another scholar swore that he dreamed of candlelight reflecting off a silver ring she once wore, despite the fact that no surviving document described the ring with clarity. Ordinary visitors, when shown the fragment of her portrait, often stood before it in silence for a long while, not with fear, but with the heavy sensation of facing someone who had been wronged so deeply that anger was no longer enough to describe it. Researchers began to realize that she represented something far larger than a forgotten queen. She became a symbol for countless women. History had pushed into silence women deemed inconvenient, unrecorded, erased for the comfort of those in power. Her disappearance no longer seemed like an isolated incident of the Tudor era. It became a reminder that every age had hidden people away to preserve the reputations of the mighty. Then, another discovery pushed the story into an entirely new realm. In a French archive, scholars found a brief entry written by a Tudor envoy. The sentence, written in Latin, read, "She still lives, though no one is permitted to see her." No one could determine whether it was metaphor or truth, yet the ambiguity opened a door that could not be closed. Was it possible she had not died on the night she vanished? Was she moved under cover of darkness to a convent or a distant estate? Or did the statement mean something different, that her ideas survived even when her body did not? From that moment, her presence shifted again, not as a spectre, not as a rumour, but as a historical puzzle generations felt compelled to solve. Documentaries traced her faint footsteps. Exhibitions featured the torn portrait fragment under dim lighting, drawing crowds who spoke in whispers without knowing why. Journalists wrote about her with reverence and unease. Students argued about her disappearance in thesis papers. The silence that once buried her now amplified her. Her absence had become her loudest form of existence. People found themselves unable to dismiss her story. They wondered how a woman could be erased so completely, yet refuse to fade. They wondered what she had known, what danger she posed, what truth lay beneath the revisions, and they wondered what it meant for them. For if a queen could be erased, what of a servant? A daughter? A writer? A healer? A woman who dared to speak when others demanded silence? She became a mirror, reflecting an uncomfortable truth. History is not a record of all that happened, but a record of what the powerful allowed to remain. As the 20th century deepened, her presence seeped into culture. A novelist based a character on her. A playwright staged a production in which she appeared only as a voice behind a curtain. A historian confessed that each time he attempted to write about another queen, he found his thoughts drifting back to her. Even skeptics admitted that the coincidence of her traces strained belief. What terrified people most was not the possibility that she had lived, but the possibility that she had refused to die in the way history demanded. Because some stories do not end when they are erased. Some stories wait. They linger at the threshold of memory, like footsteps behind a closed door, like breath on glass that should not be warm, like a voice heard but not spoken. And the more the world tried to explain her away, the more undeniable she became. Her silence had turned into a language. Her absence had turned into a presence. And the question she left behind settled into the minds of anyone who heard her story. If she can return from erasure, who else might be waiting beneath the pages? A new century arrived, and scholars no longer tried to fill the gaps surrounding her. They began to read the gaps themselves. Her absence had become the evidence. For no tyrant goes to the trouble of burning portraits, scraping ink from records, and breaking seals from heraldry, merely to erase a forgettable queen. The more thorough the erasure, the more certain people became that she once held something dangerous, something worth burying. The places once connected to her began to feel awake. In an old monastery, workers dismantling ancient choir stalls discovered a tiny rose carved into the inner beam, hidden where no eye could ever have seen it. No inventory listed it, no artisan signed it. At a small chapel in Kent, a candle burned low, revealing a metal disc fused into the base, engraved with 2 letters intertwined in the same pattern as those attributed to her handwriting. History had attempted to sweep her aside, but it was the persistence of these traces that brought her back. People no longer cared whether she had been saint or sinner, virtuous or cunning. What they wanted to understand was why one of the most powerful courts in Europe had erased her so completely. That alone was enough to turn curiosity into a flame that passed from generation to generation. Modern historians began to see that her story was not the tragedy of a single woman, but a pattern repeated throughout time. When power feels threatened, it erases the one who frightens it. When truth becomes inconvenient, records are rewritten, and when love becomes the obsession of a king, the consequences are buried under stone. But the public sensed something deeper. She was not merely the victim of a Tudor court. She became a symbol for all those whom history had rendered silent. For when people gazed at the half-face in the rediscovered portrait fragment, they recognized something painfully familiar: the sorrow of being misunderstood, the fear of being forgotten, the longing to be seen. She became an emblem not because of what she had done, but because of what had been done to her. When a name is cut from history with ruthless precision, people feel compelled to seek it out, as though justice itself requires restitution. Researchers compiled every trace letters, fragments, rumoured sightings, erased passages, and observed another unsettling truth. The erasure was not sloppy. It was meticulous, coordinated, intentional across regions, archives, languages. Someone, or perhaps many, had ensured that her memory dissolved across the kingdom. And yet, it did not. For each document missing, there was a phrase lingering in a sermon. For each scraped ledger, there was a whispered recollection in a village. For each portrait burned, there was a sketch hidden under another canvas. The silence surrounding her had become porous. In universities, students debated whether she had been hidden away rather than killed. In lecture halls, professors spoke cautiously about the consort removed from the timeline. In private gatherings, women spoke her name with a sense of inheritance. Even those who dismissed superstition admitted there was something uncanny about how her story resurfaced. The digital age magnified her further. Images of the portrait fragment circulated online. The silver rose necklace became a symbol shared across articles and forums. Amateur historians mapped the locations of finds, creating constellations across England lines that converged toward the very palace that once sealed the hallway where her portrait hung. And through it all, one sentiment grew. She was never meant to disappear. People sensed that her removal had been too total to be ordinary, too deliberate to be coincidence, too synchronized to be accidental, which meant something else. Someone had feared her. Not her beauty, not her influence, but the truth she carried. A truth that might have altered the lineage. A truth that might have exposed a betrayal. A truth that might have rewritten the crown itself. Thus she evolved from mystery into movement. Artists painted her without knowing her face. Writers invented her voice, only to find echoes in real letters. Historians who resisted studying her confessed, privately, that she haunted their thoughts, because she represented the unfinished, the censored, the redacted, the silenced, and the more people searched, the clearer the realization became. When history tries too hard to erase someone, it reveals exactly where to look. Her story now lived in the tension between what was recorded and what was removed, and that tension whispered a promise. She would not stay forgotten. Even though she disappeared from the records, she did not disappear from the mind of the man who once called himself king. As age tightened around him and illness hollowed him out, Henry began to see nameless visions, hallways folding into themselves, a room containing only a single chair turned toward the wall, candle flames shivering as though they were breathing. His dreams no longer filled with battlefields or coronations, but with silhouettes standing behind doors just slightly ajar. Physicians claimed it was fever, rot in the leg, flesh decaying from within. But that was not the truth. Henry began speaking to the darkness, first in whispers, then louder, until the guards outside his chamber startled at the sound. He demanded that a sacred painting be covered, claiming the eyes within it followed him, knowing every secret he had buried. He stopped reading prayers midway, standing still for so long that no one dared approach him. On some nights, he cried out a name none could fully hear. Only the final sound reached them, shaped like a plea rather than a command. A priest once claimed that the scent Henry described, roses and smoke, was the fragrance of forgiveness denied. By morning, that priest was exiled, sent away before he could repeat the thought. Henry began writing confessions, only to burn them moments later. The final sentence always stopped at the same place. She deserved. Never completed. The ashes clung to the hearth for months afterward, black smudges that refused to be swept clean. In his final years, Henry feared neither God nor enemy. He feared silence. The silence of a woman he now understood he could not erase from his mind, even though he had erased her from every book. Servants whispered that he paced without reason, avoiding mirrors, avoiding shadows, avoiding sleep. His hands trembled each time he passed the sealed hallway, though no one spoke of why. When he died, Whitehall grew heavy. People swore the corridors turned colder, that candles extinguished faster, that the hunting hounds howled when they neared the door of his final chamber. Then came the great fire of Whitehall. Flames devoured nearly everything except the wing where the king had died. Witnesses insisted the fire curved away, leaving that room untouched, as if restrained by an unseen boundary. Survivors swore they heard bells ringing, though no bell tower stood nearby. The room became a tomb for a secret. And her shadow, though no one dared say it was believed to be the thing Henry never escaped, even in death. Over time, caretakers refused to sleep in that wing. Night watchmen rotated quickly, none lasting long. One claimed the air smelled faintly of rose petals soaked in rain. Another said he heard fabric brushing stone, though the halls were empty. A third resigned after seeing a candle flame bend toward the sealed door, as though drawn by breath. No chronicle recorded this, no official report acknowledged it. But the stories settled into the stones. Whitehall was rebuilt, repainted, redefined, but the room remained locked, sealed beneath the justification of structural instability. Yet those who worked nearby noted peculiar things: wax pooling in perfect circles, frost forming indoors, quills rolling from desks without being touched. It was not haunting. It was remembering. For Henry, the final truth had come too late. He had commanded armies, broken kingdoms, rewritten faith itself, but he could not rewrite the memory of a woman who refused to die in his conscience. And those who inherited his throne inherited his silence. None spoke her name. None asked the question out loud. But each walked a little faster past the sealed room. The fire that spared her absence became part of the legend. Some said she returned to claim what was owed. Some said God defended her memory. Others believed Henry's fear shielded the room even after his last breath. But the most unsettling belief was whispered only once, and never again, that the room was not spared from the fire. The fire was spared from her. For if she could burn from the records, and burn from the portraits, and burn from the lineage, then perhaps the flames themselves knew better than to touch what the king could not destroy. And so the silence continued, soft as ash, patient as breath, waiting for the moment someone would dare to speak her name again. Long centuries after Henry had turned to dust, her story continued to flow like an underground stream. No one trembled when speaking of her anymore. There was only a quiet stillness, the kind that comes from realizing that a woman had been erased so perfectly that the erasure itself became proof she once existed. The old libraries, the cracked corridors, the paintings turned to face the wall, all of them seemed to whisper that silence is never complete. One archivist claimed that when he reached the scratched-out portion of her name in a brittle ledger, he heard the faint rustle of pages beside him, though he worked alone. A young researcher said that when she looked at the half-portrait, the eyes shifted with the movement of light, not frightening, but carrying something like a reminder. Gradually, people understood. She was no longer a historical figure, but a question. A question about power and forgetting, about who history belongs to, the one who records it, or the one written out of it. The legacies of Henry, his throne, his decrees, his triumphs, became museum pieces, dusted by gloved hands. But her story moved like a flame passed forward, flickering alive in each new era that discovered a missing line, a scraped date, a torn seal. She became a symbol for those swallowed by history women whose voices were too sharp for courts to endure, those erased for refusing to fit the mould. No one knew her true face. Yet that very absence made the half-portrait universal. Anyone who stood before it saw themselves reflected in the missing half, stifled, overlooked, yet quietly defiant against disappearance. In every gallery where the fragment was displayed, visitors lingered before it far longer than before any crown or sceptre. Not because of fear, but because of recognition. No screams reached across the centuries. Only stillness. A stillness that echoed through time, carrying the presence of someone who chose secrecy over obliteration. The story did not resolve with certainty, nor with revelation, but with a question. How many more times will history repeat the same wound gilded, justified by power, yet still leaving behind the shadow of the one erased? The brushstrokes of her face may fade, but the gaze remains. And so, in the end, she won not by ruling, not by surviving in flesh, but by becoming the thing history could not forget.